Hey everyone, Cool Kid here. This is going to be a lot different from the stuff that I normally make. I don't have a script or anything right now, I'm just kind of reading off a list of bullet points, but there was a very interesting Twitter firestorm that happened recently, and I wanted to talk about it, because I think that the discussion surrounding the whole thing is, I don't know how to put this. There's a lot of thoughts that I have, so I'm just kind of recording this off the cuff to talk about it, and to kind of further the wider discussion going on. So, for those who don't know, Pablo posted a tweet the other day showing two things. One was a graph showing what warframes are used the most in Elite Temporal Archimedea and Elite Deep Archimedea, and then the other thing was this image. So, I think that the implication of this is pretty clear. It's difficult to accept for Pablo that maybe Hildryn is too strong if she's this overrepresented in the game's most difficult content. But a lot of the response to this, which I think is valid in some ways and in some ways it's not, was that Hildryn is not necessarily the problem, so much as that she just works really well in Archimedea because she's immune to several of its major pain points. So I kind of want to go over all of the discussion surrounding this graph and sort of the implication of Pablo posting it, talk about why Hildryn is popular in Archimedea, why certain other frames are popular in Archimedea, what does this mean for the state of Hildryn herself being too powerful in the wider game, and more musings on Archimedea and Hildryn themselves, as well as a bit about the wider community discussion surrounding things, because I feel like the discourse around this has been kind of frustrating for me to read, but we'll get to that. So, first thing I want to talk about is why is Hildryn so overrepresented in this graph? I mean, if you look at Hildryn, she is like 3 times more popular, if not more, than her two closest neighbors, Dante and Valkyr. She is vastly overrepresented. So, of course, the natural question is, why is that? Why is she so high? Well, I think that there are 2 major reasons for that. Several modifiers do not affect Hildryn, and she has an exalted weapon. So, to talk about the first point, many modifiers in this mode, Hildryn does not have to care about. Constricted doesn't affect her because she doesn't have energy. Energy exhaustion doesn't affect her because she doesn't have energy. Untreatable doesn't really matter to her because she doesn't need health orbs. Permanent injury, in a similar vein, she doesn't rely on her health. Same with like fractured armor and stuff like that. And honestly, the list goes on. There are enough modifiers in the game that it's hard to list them all off the top of my head. But I would wager that she's straight up immune to like half of them, and a lot of the ones that she is still affected by don't really matter that much at the end of the day. There are some that are still quite bad for her, especially like Vampiric Liminus is a huge weakness for Hildryn, but generally speaking, she doesn't really have to care about like the vast majority of modifiers in the mode. And I think that speaks to the modifiers themselves just being really frustrating for a lot of players. Not just that, of course, like Hildryn is immune to them, so of course people are gonna pick her, right? Because even if the modifiers weren't super oppressive, Hildryn's immune to them, so you'd still be taking on a burden that you don't have to take on if you're not picking her. I think it's important to, point that out. Even if the modifiers weren't as oppressive, Hildryn would still be the best option here. But I also think it speaks to the fact that, like, she's so overwhelmingly picked because people just don't want to deal with a lot of them. Especially when you have combinations that make it, like, borderline impossible to, like, cast your abilities or use your weapon or something. It's just not fun. And so Hildryn is the path of least resistance, when otherwise you have to like pop 2 Advil and spend the next hour hoping you can get through that shit. So again, I think she would still be the most popular pick if these modifiers weren't cancer, because obviously if she's not affected by them, she's still the best option. But I think that the issue is exacerbated by the fact that these modifiers are so annoying to deal with, especially in conjunction. The other major thing I want to point out is that Hildryn has an exalted weapon, which is a huge advantage in Archimedea. Because of the fact that she has an exalted, she is super self-reliant. All of your other loadout choices don't matter if you pick Hildryn, because she can just rely on Balefire. She doesn't have to worry about, all of her other loadout options being bad, because she doesn't really use them. She can just rely on her exalted. She has virtually infinite energy, even in spite of like all of the modifiers present in Archimedea, so she doesn't have to care, right? She can just abuse that. I think it's also important to point out that this means she's immune to even more modifiers. Things like dull blades, undersupplied, stuff like that. don't affect Hildryn if she's not using her regular weapons. So this makes her even more capable of playing this particular activity because she doesn't have to deal with those things. And kind of to solidify my point on that, if you look at this graph, Hildryn's neighbors are Dante and Valkyr, who are likely popular for the same reasons Hildryn is. Dante has access to Noctua, which is a very good exalted weapon, and he has access to Overguard, which makes him immune to a huge amount of the bullshit in this game mode. Interestingly enough, Dante is actually immune to some things Hildryn is not immune to, but in exchange, there are some things that Hildryn doesn't have to worry about that he does, like Constricted, for example. But Overguard still blocks stuff like energy exhaustion, for some reason, and he still has an exalted weapon that means he doesn't have to worry about things like Undersupplied. Dante is a very good pick here, and I would imagine that's for all the same reasons as Hildryn. Valkyr, again, same deal. She has access to an incredibly powerful exalted weapon, and while she is more affected by modifiers than the other two, I think that her stats are genuinely just so juiced that she can push through it regardless. I mean, you look at, like, Constricted. Well, between her high armor quantity and arcane battery, she can kinda just overpower the modifier to a certain extent, right? Same with things like permanent injury and what have you. She can kinda just overpower a lot of these things purely by the nature of her having a shit ton of armor and a shit ton of health. She doesn't really have to engage with these things as much as other Warframes because those base stats are so high. Kind of playing into that, I want to talk about two other very popular frames that are not nearly as represented on this graph, and those are Revenant and Wukong. Revenant is still pretty high up there. Wukong I don't think is particularly high, but I think it's interesting to talk about them in this context, right? Because they've been the most popular frames in the wider game for a really long time now, and yet they're not touching Hildryn here. And I think that that's for a couple major reasons. For Revenant, he does have access to invincibility, he doesn't have to worry about dying, right? And a lot of modifiers don't affect him directly as a result of that, or they're just not a huge deal. But Revenant does have to worry about his loadout. He doesn't have an exalted weapon, so if you get bad options for like your guns, Revenant can't do a ton with that compared to Hildryn, Dante, or Valkyr. Wukong is kind of the other half of this equation. He has a very good exalted weapon in Iron Staff, but he is very negatively affected by a ton of the mode's modifiers. He doesn't have the ability to just ignore them like the most popular 3 frames on this graph. He has to engage with them a lot more. So even though he's still a very strong frame, I don't think that people want to play him here because all of the stuff that gives you a headache from this mode is still in play when using Wukong. So to kind of sum up, Hildryn is so popular in this mode, at least in my opinion, because she has access to 2 major tools. 1, she does not have to give a shit about like 70% of the mode's modifiers at least, and 2, she has an extremely powerful exalted weapon, so her wider loadout doesn't really affect her that much. And again, Dante and Valkyr are so represented here for similar reasons. But I think it's important to zero in on this a little more. Hildryn is way more popular than Dante and Valkyr. Like, more popular than the two of them combined. She is vastly overrepresented, even among the other top contenders for this mode. In an ideal world, you would expect that EDA and ETA would have somewhat similar distribution across the Warframes. That's obviously not going to happen because you have 3 choices and people will gravitate towards the strongest of the 3, right? But you would expect because of the random loadouts, it would be a lot closer than this. But Hildryn is being picked really often compared to the other frames, including the other ones that share the same advantages as her. And I think it's kind of important to analyze that a little bit more. Dante and Valkyr, again, have the same privileges as Hildryn in terms of having an exalted weapon and ignoring a ton of modifiers, but they're not nearly as popular as her. And I think that it's also important to point out that Hildryn is being this picked in the game's most difficult content. This is the kind of environment where I think balance probably matters the most because it's supposed to try and be challenging. If Hildryn is being picked this much, then clearly she is throwing off the scale of that challenge. If she is being picked even more than other frames that in theory should have much closer popularity to her because they share the same advantages, something must be up there, right? Even if Archimedea is a small slice of the game, it is the most difficult content that we have available aside from the super bosses, and honestly I wouldn't be surprised if the super bosses also had a huge amount of Hildryn representation. I say this to make this point. Hildryn being overpowered and Archimedea having problems that make her popular there are not mutually exclusive ideas. Both of these things can be true at the same time. I've seen a lot of people's replies on Twitter and just sort of in general to this with like in my Discord and stuff, people saying that Hildryn is not the problem, Archimedea is. But again, that's not necessarily how this has to work out. Hildryn can still have problems, and so can Archimedea. They can both be flawed, and it's just a perfect storm of things that's leading to this particular interaction. Hildryn is still incredibly powerful in this content and in the wider game. She's really, really good for a lot of reasons. It's just that several of the things that make her good in specific also make her good here. Archimedea is a mode that is very flawed. I have an entire video on my channel about this called Randomness is Difficulty where I talk about the problem at length, but that doesn't necessarily mean that its flaws make the discussion about Hildryn not relevant. So, to that end, I want to talk about both of these things just kind of from a more broad perspective, because I think these are both separate issues that deserve to be tackled, as opposed to one justifying changes to the other, if that makes sense. So, in regards to Archimedea, again, I made a whole video about this, but it's not going to be required viewing for what I'm about to say. I'll give you the SparkNotes version real quick. Basically, the bones of my argument in that video is that the random modifiers don't work for a couple major reasons, but a lot of it boils down to the way they are designed as like a rock, paper, scissors system, where certain modifiers target and neuter specific warframes. That would be fine in isolation, but then you have the random loadouts, meaning that you don't have control over what you get. So if you get nothing but scissors and the game just pits you up against rock after rock, it's not fair. And that's kind of my main frustration with this mode, is sometimes it's not the player's fault that they are in this situation, it's that the randomness just worked against them that week. If you have a week where all of the modifiers are really, really anti-health tanking, and every single frame you got is really geared towards health tanking, then you're gonna have a harder time than someone who got a bunch of shield-focused frames who doesn't have to engage with those modifiers. And I think that the crux of that is that I feel like Warframe is trying to have it both ways when it doesn't really work. If you want to go with random loadouts, okay, that's fine. Same with the random modifiers, I think that's fine too. The problem is when you have them both existing like this together, they're prone to creating friction. And I think, again, that's why we see frames like Hildryn and Dante and Valkyrie rise to the top. They can skirt a lot of that friction. So how do we try and fix the issues with Archimedea? Well, in my original video, I went over a couple major ideas. The big ones involved reroll tokens, so like maybe once a day or, once every now and again, you would get a reroll token that would reroll the options in one row. The other major topic that I kind of explored more with the solution was splitting it up to not be pure RNG, but instead making it so that you had 4 options, and each warframe was picked from a role. So you would get a support, a crowd control, a damage, and a tank or defender, whatever they call it, I don't remember. So both of those ideas still have their merit, but there was another solution that I don't think I explored enough, and that was dropping the randomness entirely and going all in on modifiers. Now, to be honest, I didn't really explore this as much as I should have, because I didn't really think it was going to be a super viable solution, because certain frames can just skirt a lot of the modifiers. But I think that if there was no random loadouts, then the rock, paper, scissors nature of the modifiers isn't really a problem anymore, because it would naturally push players away from certain options and towards other ones. Like, for example, if you got dropped guard, and so you had reduced overguard gain, maybe you'll play someone who isn't Dante, just kind of naturally as a result of that, as opposed to now, where if you get dropped guard and your options are like Dante, Styanax, and Frost, it's gonna kinda suck, because you're forced into that situation where all of them use overguard, and you are harshly affected by the modifier. Versus, if you get a bunch of frames who don't use overguard, the modifier doesn't do anything for you, right? So, to that end, I think that the rock, paper, scissors element works a lot better if you don't have to deal with the random loadouts. But the issue then is that there's a huge disparity in the difficulty of certain modifiers. For example, Dull Blades is a really pathetic modifier. It's just 50% reduced combo gain. It doesn't really matter. Then you have things like Transference Distortion, which remove a huge amount of options from the player because their operator is no longer part of the equation. I mean, you lose access to all of the operator's abilities, Void Sling, Void Mode, using your Necromech, just a ton of stuff, right? So after making that video, I got several comments talking about Destiny's system for this, and I know, you're welcome to laugh at me for bringing that up. But after getting back into Destiny again myself, I actually think that this is a really good idea. So, for those who don't know, Destiny has a system for modifiers, where you can pick and choose what modifiers you want to deal with, and they have varying payouts in terms of the rewards you get for taking them. So, easier modifiers don't pay you out as much, but more challenging modifiers pay you out more, and I realized this could work great in an environment like Archimedea. So say we split them up into like 3 tiers, just as kind of like a rough idea. Tier 1 is the easiest stuff, like Dull Blades. Tier 2 is for modifiers that are more difficult, but not like super hard, like undersupplied. And then Tier 3 would be for the most brutal modifiers, stuff like Transference Distortion. So then, Tier 1 modifiers would give you the lowest amount of research points, Tier 2 would be kind of the midpoint, and then Tier 3 would be the most. So the idea here is you would get a bunch of different modifiers to choose from, and now it is up to you to pick what modifiers you think you can deal with, and kind of piece things together from there when it comes to your loadout after the fact. Maybe you would have to take like every easy and every medium and like maybe a hard to get the full clear, or maybe you can just take like every hard and a couple mediums to get the full clear, or maybe like a hard and a handful of mediums and all of the easier ones. It would give the player a lot more choice to pick what specifically they want to use in the activity by letting them pick what things they need to avoid. Now, on top of that, I also think that this would mean that doubling down on the rock, paper, scissors design of modifiers would be totally warranted. If you have a system like this where you have more player agency, then making modifiers specifically target certain things I think works a lot better. So, just some examples I threw out in the prior video, things like reducing status chance, critical chance, power strength, maybe making Incarnate perks not apply, that kind of thing, wouldn't really make any sense in the current system. It would be way too oppressive. But if you were able to pick your wider loadout, these things are totally fine in my opinion, because you could avoid modifiers that you think are too difficult, right? If it doesn't jive with your build that you want to move forward with, then you just don't have to take it, and you can work around it by taking other modifiers that maybe affect your setup less. So I feel like if they were to go this route of like adding more modifiers that are, continue to double down on the rock, paper, scissors kind of design of them, but then give the player options for like which ones they want to take to reach the goal of getting all the research points, I think it would make it feel less like working with whatever bullshit you're given, right, with the current system, and more of like trying to solve a problem of like, okay, well, here are the things that I could hamper myself with. What could I take that would affect me the least? And then what can I put on in my loadout that benefits the most from my choices? There is kind of a problem with this though. Certain Warframes are still immune to a ton of the modifiers, and so if you had only a few specific modifiers that really hurt a Warframe, like Hildryn, you could still just keep picking her, because a bunch of the modifiers wouldn't affect her at all. So I think that if this was to happen, there are kind of a few ways to go about this. One, we can make certain modifiers that have not previously affected certain Warframes affect them more to kind of even the playing field. Like maybe Constricted would also affect Hildryn in some capacity, for example. We could also just have more modifiers that target those frames specifically. So maybe you could have like, take, for example, Dante, maybe that there's like a version of Dropped Guard that makes you have no overguard that's more specifically targeted at him. So it's like, okay, well, if I don't take Dante, I can just take this and it's free research points, right? But if I do take Dante, then it's gonna be a big problem. You could have things like that for Hildryn too. There is, to my knowledge, a thus far unused modifier called Exposure Curse, or I think it's called Exposed in Temporal Archimedea, that removes your shields. I think if there was like a tiered system like this, that could come back, that could be a thing, because if you saw it as like a really high difficulty option, then maybe you'll just take Inaros or Nidus or something like that. And it's kind of naturally pushing you away from Hildryn because you can take that modifier, and then you don't have to worry about, hampering yourself with that, right? It's a free pick if you just play someone who's not really hurt by it. But again, there's still the problem that a lot of the existing stuff doesn't affect frames like Hildryn, and as a result, even if you make modifiers that kind of target her, the Hildryn can still just not take them, right? You can still just take all of the other stuff that doesn't affect her. So maybe this is too heavy-handed, but something I was toying with was maybe the idea that there's a certain amount of frames that get locked out. Like after you use a frame, they are locked out for a specific period of time. So say for example, I use Hildryn, maybe for the next 3 Archimedias, I can't use her again, right? So now it's like there's some rotation that I have to build of, okay, well I can't use Hildryn, maybe I take Dante next, well now he's out of the rotation for a bit, maybe I take Valkyr next, but now she's out of the rotation for a bit, right? Instead of using the loadout restrictions to stop you from being able to pick whatever you want, right? And sort of taking away a lot of the agency that comes from building your loadout. Instead, these restrictions would be specifically like, okay, I don't think you should be, crutching on this frame exclusively. Maybe they need to go out of the pool for a little bit. Maybe you shouldn't be able to pick them for a little while, right? I don't really know if that's the best solution, but I think it could be a way to make frames that are exceptionally powerful in this environment a little more toned down. And, you could do this with the weapons and stuff too, but I feel like if you were to expand it to weapons, it'd just get really annoying. I guess the problem, though, is that things like Torrid and Latum and, all of that kind of stuff would probably just get picked all the time if there wasn't any kind of restriction on them. Maybe, actually, now that I think about it, what if there were modifiers that only let you pick certain weapon types? Like maybe there was like a tier 2 modifier that was like your primary can only be an assault rifle, because there are categories for that now too, right? So maybe that's how we could kind of skirt that. Like your melee can only be a long sword or some kind of sword, for example. So you can kind of push players in that direction without having to hamper them as much as like with a Warframe, because I think that your weapon choice, generally speaking, isn't as impactful as your Warframe choice. Like it still matters, but your Warframe is like the main thing, right? So I think we could potentially kind of use the modifiers for that too, not just as like hurting the player, with some kind of debuff, and then you want to search for frames that ignore the debuff, but maybe even going the route of like, okay, you can only use these specific weapon types or something like that. I think that could potentially work as a solution for the weapons side of this, issue, is like, okay, maybe there are modifiers in play that push you towards certain weapon types so that you can benefit from or rather, you can get the rewards from those modifiers, right? The extra research points. But yeah, I think that, personally, Archimedea would be a lot more interesting, in my opinion, if they took a route like this, expanding the pool of personal modifiers, dropping the random loadouts entirely, and then kind of making it like a puzzle that you have to piece together. Again, I think we might have to lock frames out for a certain period of time if they're used, like in a specific week, because I think that frames like, especially Dante and Hildryn, to be honest, would probably just be too strong. People would just pick them over and over again because so many modifiers wouldn't affect them, that even if you made modifiers to target them specifically, I don't think it would work because there's still so many that they can ignore. Beyond Archimedea, what about Hildryn? Because to be honest, I do think that this graph is still noteworthy and still says something about Hildryn in the wider conversation. Again, Hildryn is being picked overwhelmingly more than everyone else in the hardest content available in the game that most people are going to do. So I think that's still noteworthy. Don't get me wrong, EDA and ETA should not be the sole justification for nerfing Hildryn. I don't think that at all. But I do think it is indicative of just how strong she is, if she's able to carry this much weight on her back in the hardest content available in the game currently. So, kind of branching off of that, what exactly is the problem here in terms of what makes Hildryn too good? And if they were to nerf her, what's the best way to do it? Now, if you ask me, the problem is Balefire, and more specifically Aegiscale. Hildryn has a lot of things that make her good, but the addition of Aegiscale was the thing that pushed her over the edge, if you ask me. Balefire has no line of sight requirement. It is multiplicative, I believe, with ability range mods and Firestorm. Those two mods interact multiplicatively. I guess it would be Fulmination, because it's the secondary. Her Balefire deals a shit ton of damage. It requires virtually no aiming. There's just, I don't know, there's a lot of layers to it, but I think that like the fundamental thing is Balefire. You can just kind of mash middle click, press 2 to get your shields back, and you don't really have to play the game. And I think that's kind of like the crux of the problem for me, is boredom. I get bored when I'm playing Hildryn, and I'm personally happy for Warframe to get nerfed if they make me less bored. Take, for example, Wukong's clone. Wukong got nerfed in Veilbreaker because his clone made his play too automated. He could just kind of sit there and let his clone do stuff. So his clone got pretty heavily nerfed in that update, and that was very controversial at the time. But personally, I enjoy post-nerf Wukong way more than pre-nerf Wukong, because they buffed Iron Staff. Iron Staff became a much better and much more interesting weapon after Wukong got nerfed, and they kind of had like an equivalent exchange, almost, of nerfing him in terms of power by taking away things that made his play automated or easy, but giving players more power with parts of his kit that were kind of underexplored before and that are more engaging. In the example of Hildryn, say Balefire gets nerfed, say it gets a line of sight check, or a base range reduction, or the multiplicative interaction gets removed, or something like that. Okay, but I don't think that they should just do that, right? Because that would just feel like shit. Having your frame just nerfed with no anything else just sucks. So I feel like if they were to nerf Hildryn's Balefire, I think that they should buff Haven. I think that Haven, for me, has always kind of been the outlier in Hildryn's kit. There was a point in time where it was really useful because of Blazing Pillage, weirdly enough. Back before the changes in Veilbreaker, I think it was, with armor stripping, the 50% armor reduction from Blazing Pillage was super useful. It was actually a big bump in damage. But now that you can full strip with Pillage, it doesn't really matter nearly as much. The main benefit of it really is that you can use Pillage against the Infested, because you don't have to worry about not having any armor or shields. But I think that Haven is kind of just an outlier in Hildryn's kit, and if they were going to make any changes that would nerf Hildryn, I think that it would be very warranted to buff Haven, just to kind of do that sort of wider pass over her kit and say, okay, maybe we could make more interesting stuff out of what's already here while we're taking away the parts that are boring. So with that said, I do want to say that I think Pablo only posting the graph of Archimedea was kind of a big mistake. I think it makes sense to show that, oh look, Hildryn is the most popular overwhelmingly in the game's hardest content, right? But I think it also doesn't really explain why that's the case very much, and also, Archimedea is not the whole game. Hildryn is still ridiculously effective in most of the game, right? Like if you look at, relics and stuff like that, or endless missions, a lot of content people are still doing, Archon hunts, all that stuff, she's still super good, and I imagine her play rate is still very high. And I wish that Pablo would have shown us the overall play rate as well, to put the Archimedea thing in context. Like, okay, Hildryn is picked more than other frames in the wider game, but maybe not the most. But then when you get to the hardest stuff, she's filtered out to being the top option, right? I feel like if we got to see both numbers, it would really put the Archimedea thing in context of like, okay, she's up at the top here, yes, but then in the wider game, maybe if she's even not at the top, she's still pretty highly picked. And then it's like, once you get to this really hard content, that's where she sort of rises to the top, right? I also think that a lot of the response to this has been grating for me to read, I guess. I talked about this, quite a bit already, but I think that Hildryn having issues in terms of being too strong or too automated or too brain dead, right? And Archimedea having issues that make it unfun and make Hildryn the best option just as like the path of least resistance, those are both true at the same time. But a lot of the responses to this tweet are talking about how Hildryn's not a problem at all, right? They're just like, oh no, the problem is Archimedea. And many of them are very condescending about it. Dude, honestly, miserable Twitter motherfuckers. Like, I'm sorry. I swear to God. I need to, contain myself because I'm about to go on a completely unrelated tangent that's just gonna make both of us mad, I think. But a lot of the replies to this were saying, oh no, Hildryn's not the problem, she's fine, don't nerf her, she's not an issue at all, it's purely Archimedea's design. And again, I think this is obfuscation. This reminds me a lot of when Dante got nerfed, and people were saying oh no, Dante was perfectly balanced, DE finally released a balanced Warframe and nerfed him. The real problem is that Overguard blocks Rage, or it prevents Chroma from building Vex armor. Or, this, that, and the other thing. And it's these things can be true at once. Like with Dante's nerf, right? Overguard blocking Rage was a problem that they did end up fixing. There was a real critique there, but it was being used to obfuscate from the wider issue that Dante was overpowered on release, and he was disrupting other players by stealing their kills through walls with tragedy. Don't get me wrong, Dante's nerf was extremely heavy-handed when it first happened, and line-of-sight checks were total dog shit. I think that overall, Dante's nerf was like too much at the time, but it turned into something a lot better, right? And I kind of hope that the same thing happens with Hildryn, that this discussion around potentially nerfing her, and with Archimedea kind of in the spotlight of that discussion because of this tweet, hopefully this will mean that like even if Hildryn gets nerfed, we can have a more productive set of changes about Archimedea itself. I don't hate Archimedea conceptually. In fact, I was actually super excited for it when it was first announced. I think that Warframe needs more hard content for players like myself to enjoy. But I think that when it comes to Archimedea, it's not a bad concept fundamentally, and I understand what Pablo was going for when it comes to like making an endgame activity that doesn't feel fatiguing because there's so many moving parts to it that it's not going to get old quickly. But it has some very real problems that create a lot of player frustration. And I think that that's like the thing that is the most important part of all of this, honestly, is player frustration in Archimedea. That's the thing that sucks. It's like I said in the randomness is difficulty video, it's not necessarily just the difficulty that's random, it's the fun that's random. And that for me is the main problem. When I play Warframe, I want to have fun, and I think challenging content can be fun. But when there's this lack of player agency like there is now, it just becomes frustrating. It kind of reminds me of Foley's Hunt and some of the response to that from DE, where they said that they don't want a game mode that is like so frustrating you'd rage quit, but that is Archimedea. Now, I'll admit, I don't think I've rage quit out of an Archimedea in a long time, if ever, but like I've seen people in my Discord talk about doing it, and I don't even blame them. Sometimes you're in a situation where you're just having no fun, your entire loadout sucks, you're making no progress, you're not contributing to the mission at all, and you just don't want to, like, it's not fun. I play video games to have fun. If this mode is frustrating, then I don't really want to do it. I think that there's room for difficult content in a game like Warframe, but I kind of talk about this in, I think it's DE Doesn't Understand Overguard. A horribly named video, by the way. I wish he did not name it that. But when it comes to difficulty, there's like fair and unfair difficulty. That's an overgeneralization, right? But generally speaking, I feel like Archimedea leans really hard into difficulty that does not feel fair. It doesn't feel like there's genuine counterplay because so many of your choices are made for you. I think that like the idea was probably that the research meter, right, the research points were supposed to be the difficulty slider, like, oh, if it's too hard, just, you know, take the loss in loot. But no one's gonna do that. Like, let's not kid ourselves here. No one's taking the less loot, right? At that point, they don't even want to do the mode. It's not even worth it, right, to invest that kind of time for less stuff. Personally, a good solution would be to, like I mentioned earlier in this video, kind of shift the difficulty selection or the difficulty options away from the research meter itself and more to a wider array of modifier options and letting people pick those. I think it would be a lot less frustrating and make people feel like they're really solving a puzzle with the things available in their loadout. And then again, for Hildryn, I do think she's a problem. I do think that she deals an absurd amount of damage over an absurd area. Nothing can really threaten her, and it requires very little input from the player. If she is to get nerfed, I do think she deserves to have buffs in other areas to make her more interesting. I am fine with her getting nerfed if she becomes more fun at the other end of that, right? And of course, if she like affects other players' experience and stuff less. Dude, I play solo all the time. Frankly, Hildryn's not disrupting my experience because if she's in my lobby, it's because I'm playing her. But I think it's important to acknowledge that she can hurt the experience for other players. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on this whole ordeal. I don't even know if I'm going to post this, to be honest. I'm recording this right before I'm about to go to bed. I just had a lot of thoughts about this tweet as I'd kind of looked at it again and been thinking about it. But yeah, that's kind of my opinion on this overall. Archimedea has problems, Hildryn is too strong. Both of those things can be true at once, but I don't think that they should be put in this sort of context of like this sort of direct correlation. I think that Archimedea has issues that need to be solved, and Hildryn has issues that need to be solved. But the way that this is framed is making it seem like those things are a lot more commingled than they really are. And even if Hildryn was to receive some kind of nerf, I still think she'd be super popular because of Archimedia's flaws. And if Archimedia was to be improved, Hildryn would still be super popular because she's super strong. So it's a multifaceted thing, right? This is just kind of a perfect storm of factors that has led to the situation that, we're seeing at the moment. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on the whole thing. Let me know in the comments if you thought that this was interesting. I'm not really used to doing videos like this. Honestly, I'm just kind of swamped working on like 3 other videos at the same time right now. And I saw this and I thought to myself, maybe I'll throw my hat in the ring and kind of see what people are thinking. I think it's an interesting discussion to contribute to. And I feel like a lot of people were also kind of missing the point, I guess, of like, okay, yes, there is a problem with using Archimedia as the sole benchmark for something like this, or the sole factor in whether or not something gets nerfed. But like, there's still a genuine reason to find Hildryn's placement here concerning, especially in comparison to other frames that are similar to her. So I kind of wanted to just get my thoughts out about this because I had a lot going on in my brain about it. Yeah, let me know what you think. I don't know if I want to do this kind of content more often because this is like slop maxing. Very little preparation went into this other than like organizing my thoughts in a document first. So I feel like this is pretty low effort, dude. I don't know. I don't want to sink further than this, okay? I feel like this should be like a one-off maybe. But yeah, let me know what you think, I guess. You can tell me if you want to see more. I don't know if it'll actually happen, but I guess we'll see what people think. Beyond that, higher effort stuff is in the works. I've just been bouncing around between a bunch of different projects, so they're all kind of close in terms of completion. Hopefully they'll all release around the same time as a result, so instead of like, 1 a week, it'll be like 2, maybe 3 in the span of a week. So that's kind of the current process there. Also, big thank you to my channel members for paying me to talk about this dumb bullshit. I don't know why people waste their money on my channel, but it means a lot. It means a lot. Also, thank you for watching. This was probably boring as shit, and I appreciate you wasting your time with me talking about this video game topic that people got mad about on Twitter. None of this shit is real. Like, friendly reminder, none of this actually matters. But here I am talking about it, so thank you for wasting your time with me. With all that said, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.